Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hey everyone, please enjoy John and my continuing conversation and reaction to Wesley Huff's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience.
And the story of Noah and the Ark, the Great Flood. There seems to be some parallels.
Yeah. So that's the story of Upnupishtim, which is kind of a side story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so there are actually parallels between that and, say, the Genesis 6 Noah Ark story. And I think what you're looking at there is probably a cultural remembrance of something that did take place. And so you have these adjacent cultures.
Yeah, and I think we discussed this before, but what gets me is how he immediately goes into straight up apologetics mode, but again, masquerading as some sort of historian, because, no, the interesting thing about comparing Gilgamesh to the Bible is how similar it is, and he immediately doesn't even talk about that at all. He's like, there were some similarities, but let me tell you these differences. And then I think before I actually went through and kind of itemized why they are so similar.
Yeah, you brought up before that he seems like he's almost a young earth creationist. He does seem to be saying that the flood event was a real event, and this is like a historical account, which doesn't even fit the biblical data that we have that has, multiple accounts that are combined into a narrative, and doesn't fit any archaeological evidence or geological evidence that all does not reflect a global flood at that time. And the accounts are written long enough apart that it doesn't seem plausible to me that they're both just two accounts of the same event that are at all contemporaneous. So it's a crazy claim on Wes's part, and I think that once you get into this ancient prehistory in the Bible, it's where apologetics really goes to die. It just creates a lot of problems to take those stories literally. I think at one point, John and I would like to talk about the flood in depth because there's just so many problems in the story. Scientifically, doublets, contradictions within the narrative.
Yeah, not to mention the scientific and historical problems. But
and the parallels to other ancient Near Eastern texts, too, that continually keep coming up, whether it's the Hebrew text sort of commenting on these tropes that are left over from the ancient Near East, but the intertextual relationship is pretty apparent.
Yeah, and Joe Rogan should ask him, are you a young earth creationist? Because that answer will frame the rest of his arguments for a lot of the audience. He would have no credibility in any historical and scientific standpoint if he came out as a young earth creationist. So I can't say he is, but I'm assuming he is based on the way he's answering this and defending the historicity of the Noah story against the Gilgamesh story. It's not like a lot of people haven't looked at this, and the way he presents it is so one-sided toward the extreme minority conservative view. And again, Joe Rogan just has no idea because he's not and this I don't blame Rogan for, but he's not really steeped in this type of discussion. But the cards should all be out on the table, and he should just come out and say, yeah, I'm a young earth creationist.
Yeah.
The ancient Near East, and you're seeing these kind of parallel echoes of things that actually did happen. So there are definite parallels, but I think sometimes people look at those and they overplay that. So one of the examples I often give is Advil and arsenic both come in pill form and have an A on the bottle. But it's not the similarities that matter in that case, it's the differences. And so if you look at the differences, there are significant differences in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Upnupishtim story and the Genesis 6 story. If for no other reason than the Noah Ark story is a very small part of the book of Genesis. And the story of Upnupishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is a little bit more stretched out. It has more to do with the theme of what Gilgamesh is doing in his epic. So, but there are obviously parallels between that because these are both ancient Near Eastern stories and they're products of their day. In the same way that I think you see parallels between some of the New Testament Gospels and other ancient Greco-Roman biography.
So before he goes on, I think that he talks a little bit more about the ancient Greco-Roman biographies, so I have a little bit more to say about that. But I'll wait to see if he expands on it a little bit more.
I think that to expand on what I was saying earlier, what's interesting here is what he's leaving out. To an audience that really doesn't know much about Noah's Ark and Gilgamesh, which I assume Joe Rogan's audience is not really well steeped in all this stuff, you'd think you would get a basic overview, but he's not doing that. He's not saying, for instance, that Gilgamesh was written before Genesis, which is an important fact. And there's a lot of other details that would seem to cut against a young earth creationist view of this account. But he's coming on as some kind of expert historian, but then he's leaving out the fundamental basics that everybody should know before they even analyze this at all.
Yeah, in general, he's not giving the type of context that you would want if you were taking a class on this literature. Like, what's the literary distinction between, well, the flood is a huge part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's only a small part of the Book of Genesis? What difference does that make?
Right.
That's not really a literary analysis.
That's a good point, yeah.
The flood narrative is older than Gilgamesh, too. I think it's adopted from older texts into the Gilgamesh epic, if I'm remembering correctly. This is one of the frustrating things that I think apologists do a lot of the time, is they say stuff like that, and you're just supposed to kind of nod along, but what is the actual analysis there? Obviously, this one is shorter than the other one. Well, that's not really telling me anything.
Right.
Why is it like that?
Yeah.
What does that composition then tell us about these texts? He doesn't answer that question.
Yeah, but also to your point, for me, the biggest thing that I keep coming back to over and over is I feel like it's a bait and switch. Rogan is introducing this person as some sort of historian, but he's really an apologist, and they're not being upfront that what he's clearly doing is apologetics through this entire thing. You can see by the way he frames every answer that it's always to steer you toward the most conservative, fundamentalist view of these issues, which is not at all the mainstream of what historians and scientists say about these things. I wouldn't have as much of a problem if he said, hey, I'm a Christian apologist, I'm going to try to convince you guys to become a Christian. Well, I'd be surprised if Joe Rogan would want a person like that on, and I see this all over the place now. This trend is super popular, and it goes all the way back. We did our whole thing on Josh McDowell, and we talk a lot about Lee Strobel, and these are people saying, I'm just a journalist. I'm not a Christian apologist. I'm doing journalism. And it's a lie. And they should just come out and say, no, I'm actually a pastor, and I'm trying to persuade you to join my religion. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, good point. We're left with the two options being Billy Carson's crazy new agey interpretation of ancient religion, and Wes Huff giving you Christian apologetics that's sort of dressed up as history, and neither of those are actually good. These people are not the qualified experts that should be going on the largest podcast in the world to talk about these issues. There are people that legitimately study this full time, that have written peer-reviewed articles or peer-reviewed books, that have been vetted, that have gone through critical engagement with other scholars, and those are the ones, they would be able to explain these literary functions in the text.
Which,
They
by
would
the
be able to
way, would be a lot more interesting also.
I think there's actually a hunger for that out there. Joe Rogan is a bland version of what people actually really want, which is to learn things.
Right.
Like when they're taking these oral traditions, like Socrates is famous for saying that he didn't believe that you should write things.
Yeah,
Right,
make people lazy.
Right, it make you lazy. You need to learn how to remember things. You need to exercise your memory, which is so fascinating when you think that there must have been people that were in charge of memorizing these oral traditions.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're talking about the Old Testament, the series of writings, like these are long stories that someone had to remember and pass on to generations. So the thing with me was always like, well, what was the origin of all this? What was the first version?
This is to your earlier point about Joe Rogan has a total misconception here, and he's obviously just obsessed with this idea of how the Old Testament had been passed down through the centuries without any major changes. And your point is right. He has a total misconception about that whole point. It was not passed down through the millennia only through oral tradition. That's totally incorrect. And we'll see if Wes Huff corrects him here, but I don't think he's going to.
Yeah, it's frustrating. There's a couple things that he got wrong. Most people would just be listening and remembering in the ancient world because most people couldn't write or read. It's only when you get to the time of the New Testament that you're starting to really develop a literary culture where there's people are collecting works in libraries in their homes, and a real culture around being literate is forming. I don't think that people would have been writing stuff down as someone was saying it, but I also don't think that, like you said, that people, when they were writing the Hebrew Bible, were going back and just relying on a tradition that was passed along orally through all that time. No, they had written sources.
There's a text chain that goes back to the earliest writings all the way to the latest writings. It's nowhere in that chain was it passed down orally between them.
Yeah. Or, again, the New
I'm not saying
Testament
that oral
scholars-
tradition wasn't a thing, but it was a thing in local communities. That's how local communities would memorize. But the literary tradition, it's a written tradition.
Yeah, I mean, Moses didn't give the law to the Israelites in the desert, and then they passed it along to their kids, and their kids passed it along to their kids, and their kids passed it along to their kids, until finally someone wrote it down 300 years later. Like, that's just not the way that it worked.
Right. And we don't even know if Moses existed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, aside from the most basic problems with that scenario, it's just not the way that things were transmitted. I want to give Wes a chance to respond, but it doesn't represent the way these texts were actually created. The Hebrew Bible is being written when the Israelites are in captivity, post the destruction of the northern kingdom first, and combining of the two kingdoms. That really initiates the writing of the first part of the what we call the Old Testament. And then it's written periodically, but it's written about events that happened in the past. It's written taking sources from the past. It's combining sources from the north and south. It's a much more complicated process than the way that Joe is understanding it. And I'm sure that Joe's audience understands it. And I really just hope that Wes hears what I'm hearing and tries to make it a little bit more clear for Joe.
Okay.
Where the hell did it come from? And what was it? What was going on? Where these people felt like in this time of incredibly difficult survival, right? You're hunter-gatherers, right? We're talking about thousands of years ago. And these people took great time and made great effort to preserve these stories. And then there's always human error, right? There's human error, as you were saying, with transcription and trying to decipher things and writing things down where you don't really speak the language. You got to wonder, like, how much did we lose in this oral tradition? Like, what was the original?
It wasn't hunter-gatherers. There was no writing when the hunter-gatherers were the predominant.
Right.
I mean, I don't know what he's imagining, that Adam was writing stuff down in the garden. Those stories are not real. They don't reflect actual history.
Yeah, I think I take that for granted a lot because when I hear it, it's just so mythological to me. So I'm not even giving it any credence that there's some kind of real history here.
But I think that people should think there was a time when there were hunter-gatherers, and it was tens of thousands of years ago.
Right.
But this is post-agrarian, post-civilization. By the time the Bible's being written, but everything is post-civilization. All of this stuff, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Akkadians, these are all developed civilizations that had their own writing. I don't think Joe has any real understanding of ancient history or the development of human civilization. It's not hunter-gatherers that are trying to write down the first stories of human beings ever. That's not what the Bible actually is.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier about when the Old Testament actually was written would surprise a lot of people. Because yes, it's describing things that happened supposedly at the beginning of time, but actually the Old Testament was written not much earlier than the New Testament.
Story, and what were they trying to convey?
Yeah, and I think that there's an aspect of like a message that's trying to be communicated. I mean, we are modern people of the Enlightenment. So we almost have a perspective where we want something to be very exhaustive, that ancient writers didn't have those same sort of conventions. Or so they're going to capitalize on certain ideas and concepts for the purpose of, when someone tells you a story, you don't memorize everything.
Right.
You go to university, you write notes, right? The people who are writing everything the professor is saying word for word, probably not the people who are going to remember what the professor says as well as the people who write down the main things. And when you write down the main things, the main points, without all of the other stuff that kind of is just, it's icing, then you get the main idea more. Ancient writers talk about this. So there's a guy named Quintilian who exists in the 1st century BC. And there's this series of writings that we call progymnasmata, which are basically like, how do you do good writing? So he's training people, maybe even individuals like Plutarch, who is one of the best known ancient biographers, and saying, like, it's just as important what you don't say as to what you do say. Because, A, writing in the ancient world is expensive, really expensive, and B, you want to make sure that your audience is actually getting the message that you want to convey. And so this is something that when you read, like, German scholars, biblical scholars of the 19th and 20th century, or even prior to that, like 18th, 19th century, they look at the Gospels and they're like, this isn't biography, because it's not capitalizing on Jesus' childhood. And we all know that good biographies tell about your childhood and psychologize and these sorts of things. Whereas if you look at some of these ancient writers who are talking about how you should write biography, they say, if there's nothing in their childhood that's that significant, don't write it.
First of all, he's a little all over the place here.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the Gospels. I thought we were talking
I
about
know.
the Old Testament. And the difference between the Gospels and the Old Testament is huge. And I feel like he never actually comes out and says what his opinion is. He's making a case for something without ever laying out, hey, this is how I think it happened. And part of the reason he's doing that is because the way he thinks it happened is not the way scholars think it happened. So, again, it's really underhanded here. And I feel like it's a little all over the place. Joe Rogan is not following. Every time Joe Rogan jumps in, he goes back to a really broad concept that has nothing to do with what he was just talking about.
Yeah, I think Joe Rogan should have Robin Faith Walsh on because it would be so much more interesting. She's so captivating and smart and engaging, and the way that she explains this is so much more illuminating than what Wes is doing. What he's saying makes no sense. He doesn't talk about the actual production of text at all. So we know in antiquity, Candida Moss talks about this in her new book, God's Ghostwriters, where she talks about the enslaved scribes who wrote the New Testament. They would have a tablet that they would write in shorthand. And basically, the shorthand would be something that was developed by that particular scribe. And so you have an author or the person that's speaking. Then that scribe would go and take the shorthand and expand it out and make it sound better and try to highlight the best things about the author and create a text that is rhetorically strong and that sounds more intelligent, that reflects well on the sender. That was a scribe's job. Like, we do have examples of this in antiquity. I think Pliny the Elder talks glowingly about his scribe. I think he even dedicates a book to his scribe. One of those ancient writers. I think it's Pliny the Elder. So, and then eventually, once you have the text edited, then you could transfer it onto papyrus or something like that. Wes is right. That would be expensive. So not just anyone could do this. You needed to have access to someone that was educated, a scribe, probably a slave. So that means you have to have whatever money it takes to own that slave, whatever money it took to educate that slave. You have to have the materials to do the writing. And a lot of times it was multiple people that were working on text. This was not just a simple thing that Peter the fisherman could do on day one. This is just not realistic. So part of the way that he is creating this sort of alternate history is just totally inaccurate to how texts were actually produced. And then the other thing that's really frustrating is the ancient biography. These apologists all say, oh, the Gospels are ancient biographies. They have the same conventions as ancient Roman and Greek biographies. And then Wes says something totally ridiculous, like that you should highlight things in their childhood that make them look good. But the Gospels don't have that. But unfortunately, Wes, the Gospels do have that.
Right.
Literally, we have a story about Jesus going to the temple and reading from the Isaiah scroll and amazing all the priests of the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and anyone that's listened to the show knows that we can really dive into that because that's super interesting stuff. That's why I'm a little frustrated here because he's really jumping all over the place. He's making arguments in favor of conservative apologetic points that no one is at this point in the conversation even arguing against, and he hasn't even set up the premise. So he's just kind of bouncing around.
Yeah. The more that I have watched his content, for lack of a better word, I think that he really does have a very tight parameter that he sticks within. And he's probably trying to be a good politician and answering the question that he wants to answer, not necessarily the question that's asked, because it does seem to be not really what Joe was talking about. And then the other thing is that there are a lot of things that are in the Gospels that are totally in line with Greco-Roman biographies, like miraculous births of important people, the deeds of great men. wise sayings of philosophers and spiritual teachers, disappearing bodies that mean someone has become a god. So these things also turn up in Greco-Roman biographies often.
Right, like the idea that even if you accept what he's saying, that these are biographies, that doesn't at all lend credibility to their historicity. And of course, he's not saying that.
Plutarch talks about Apollonius of Tyana or Romulus, but he talks about apotheosis. He talks about people becoming gods. And Plutarch is supposed to be the gold standard of a Greco-Roman historian that the apologists always bring up. But you can easily find themes that show up in the gospel, and even things like the way that the preface in Luke, the dedication in Luke, talks about how it's, scrupulously writing down the correct version of the story. You find that in other Greco-Roman biographies too. But we also know that in those biographies, they're stretching the truth. We have admissions from authors that say, I tried to reflect history very closely here, but in some places, I kind of just chose what would be the best way to teach the best lesson. So these are not historical accounts the way that we would think of historical accounts.
Right.
From, like, if there is something, say, like Jesus' birth, or Luke tells a story when he's 12 of Jesus, when he goes with Mary and Joseph, and, Mary and Joseph lose the Son of God, and they
my point still stands.
I was going to say.
start going home without him, and they're like, where's Jesus? And they got to go back to Jerusalem. That's a significant story, and so it appears that Luke includes it because there's a significant reason to include that. But they wouldn't have had any problem with leaving out large portions of someone's life if it didn't contribute to what the ultimate goal of telling that person's life was.
I think what's important is we have to try, as difficult as it might be, to put our minds in the context of people who lived in a time where most people were illiterate. And you're telling these parables, you're telling these stories as an oral tradition, and that they have a different mindset in terms of the distribution of information.
Totally.
And what the significance of these things are.
Yeah.
The oral tradition is what led up to the Gospels. If we're talking about the Gospels now, the oral tradition is not after we have the Gospels. Very clearly, after we have the Gospels, we have a paper trail that goes back all the way to the first century. The earliest stuff, we just have postage stamp size fragments. But as you go through the centuries, we can clearly see that these were being copied and sent around and distributed and then copied again. This was not an oral tradition. So Joe Rogan has the complete misconception here. And again, Wes is not correcting him on that.
The biggest frustration that I have is that Joe Rogan is going to walk away from this just as confused as when it started, except that maybe he's going to know some more apologist bullshit talking points. Another thing that's funny is that as we got later Gospels, we did get stories of Jesus' childhood. The infancy Gospel of James, it's all Jesus running around as a kid, doing miracles, killing other children, killing and then raising them most of the time. We have accounts of Jesus learning how to read in Greek. He strikes his teacher mute. As these stories continue to evolve post the Gospels that are canonical, we do get those different literary conventions fulfilled, even if they are missing in the Gospels that we have. The other thing that Wes really needs to, or I wish that he would answer, is, because I think you and I talk about this a lot, is there are different reasons that the Gospel writers are writing. I don't think that you can just assume that they have the same uniform purpose in why they're writing the Gospels. That's part of the flaw of the community model, where we're just assuming that Mark is writing for a community that Mark is the spokesperson for, and he's writing a purely theological text that is meant to prove the religion that the author, quote unquote Mark, is also a member of. We should take a step back and question all of those things. We don't know exactly what type of literature it is that Mark is writing. We don't know exactly for what purpose. And some things assumed about Mark, like, for example, the Messianic secret or literary training that Mark has, could also be part of what Mark is doing. In the same way that Ernest Hemingway wrote in a simple, abrupt style, Mark is doing something similar with the way that he uses Greek. We shouldn't always just immediately draw the theological and traditional Christian assumption about these works without critically examining that.
Right.
In terms of the Bible, like, as someone who identifies as a Christian, I would say that the Bible is written for you, but it wasn't written to you. It had a completely different original audience. Mm-hmm. But you should do your best at figuring out who it was written to and how that made a difference to them, because then the application is going to come out even clearer for you. And that should be ultimately, the goal of everyone who's looking at ancient documents. Who was the original audience? How would they have understood it?
Yeah.
Because you can read all sorts of things because of your modern conventions into what someone is talking about in the ancient world and completely bypass what they're actually trying to convey in their intention.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a German romantic Bible scholar from the 1800s that's obsessed with folk and community and Geist and the spokesman for the real life of the peasantry, you may think that the gospel writers are just writing the same way the Grimm brothers are writing. But you would be reading back into that. So unfortunately, you've ruined biblical scholarship. Thanks a lot, German romantics.
I mean, I think that he's making a lot of really broad statements that some of what he's talking about are the biggest discussions going on in New Testament studies right now, and there's not a very clear answer to it. Like, who the original audience was, that's the forefront of what's happening right now in New Testament scholarship. There's lots of interesting works coming out from a lot of different people, and there's not a very clear answer to that. Like Ben, the one that was talking about the Johannine community, the scholar.
Hugo Mendez.
Yeah, like Hugo Mendez will have a very different answer than another scholar might. And it's just not as clear-cut as he's making it seem. But to say that it wasn't originally written for Christians, I mean, the Gospel of Luke kind of explicitly says that it was. He says, I'm making an account of everything that happened amongst us. I don't even understand what his point is anyway, even if that's, you know what I mean? Even if that's what he's saying.
Like you said, it's very much like a pastor. It's not written to you, but it's written for you.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't think that you and I are that concerned about the devotional reading of the Bible or what it's trying to say to us spiritually, necessarily. In a certain way, that's very true. It's not written to us, and it's not written in our time. I think that's something that John and I like to emphasize a lot, and we should try to understand it. I just don't have a lot of confidence that Wes is doing a good job creating the environment that people are equipped to actually understand who the text is to.
He's making a serious spiritual claim when he says it is written for us. What you're saying basically is this ancient document that's not written to us, but it is for us now. He wouldn't say that about any other document. And again, this is just highlighting he's not a historian. He's an apologist. Because he wouldn't say that about any other ancient work.
Yeah. Seneca was not writing, he was not writing to us or for us, even though his writings have been preserved, and we have them today, some of his writings. It doesn't mean that he had any intention of those writings being preserved, or he was thinking in 2,000 years they're going to be reading my writings. The other thing is, the one thing that we can assume about the audience for the Gospels is that it was some sort of a literary network, because that was the people that were reading literary texts at that time. People make this assumption that there's this clear continuity between the way that the Jewish religion curated texts and then the way the Christian community started to curate texts. And I just don't think that there is that historical line that runs between those two. I don't think that these texts were written primarily to communities of believers. I think that they were written within a network of other literary authors and texts, because that's just the way that texts were circulated in the ancient world. You can see the same type of mutations happening in the texts of the Gospels that you see in other works that were sort of floating through literary networks, where they borrow themes, they use the same tropes, they reference each other. If you look at the Gospels themselves as a closed literary network, it's sort of like the episode we did.
Oh, Julia Sweeney,
where the Gospels, you're almost looking at rewrites, exaggerations of the initial text that's going through this network.
My point is that there's so much more to this than he's making it seem. And,
he's totally oversimplifying.
And it's actually super fascinating. And what's fascinating about it is everything that he's not talking about.
And again, it's almost impossible to put your mind completely into the context of these people that were living then. It's almost impossible to imagine the way they viewed the world and the way they communicated. You know, and when you're dealing with like really old stuff like the Sumerian text, and then people have translations of it which can be fantastical, like the Zechariah Sitchin stuff. It's like you have to be a scholar in ancient Sumerian and understand the origins of language, and you have to. And then still, there's massive debate. I mean, there's a whole website called sitchiniswrong.com.
Yeah.
But he's the most fun.
He's fun. I'm not convinced he could read Sumerian either.
Really?
Yeah.
I think he was both.
It's just hilarious. Joe Rogan's like, have you heard of this scholar? He's like, yeah, that guy's not real. I'm not a real scholar, but that guy's not real either.
I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt. He takes so many liberties with the stuff he's commenting on that I have a hard time getting my head around. Where Sumerian predates Akkadian, but Akkadian develops alongside. And then, as cultures like the Assyrians come into power and kind of subvert the Sumerians.
So oldest Sumerian writing is what? What's the oldest timeline?
Like
5,000? 6,000?
Yeah, around that. I think like 4 to 5,000 years ago.
Okay. And then Akkadian is when?
There's some overlap, but it develops into a language like just after, like the rise. And Akkadian develops into like it has stages, and then you have like Babylonian, Proto-Babylonian, Persian, Old Persian, Elamite, as we look at.
We don't have it. There's no writing at all at Göbekli Tepe, correct? It's all just iconography.
Yeah, or at least that we've figured out that looks like writing. Yeah, I'm really hoping to go to Göbekli Tepe.
What's your take on this whole reluctance to further excavate, and how they have such a small amount of the site? It's only 5% that's been uncovered, but through LiDAR, they're aware there's a bunch more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an archaeologist. I have friends who are archaeologists, and I think Archaeology is tricky because so much of archaeology is dependent on governments and institutions and funding. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly incentive by the Turkish government to want to capitalize on that being a tourist destination. And you really need to safeguard archaeological excavations because otherwise it's being compromised,
Right.
and like pillaging and stuff like that. It happens. I mean, when I was in Egypt 2 summers ago, and you go to the Valley of the Kings, they've got security cameras up everywhere because there are tombs there that we still haven't discovered. And so they're like, we don't want people digging around in here looking for...
Well, they've lost so much over their history.
Oh, we've only discovered 1% of ancient Egypt.
That's so nuts.
1%. Isn't that crazy?
That is the nuttiest part of all of history is Egypt to me. I still have not been. I definitely will. But it is, to me, the nuttiest time in history because good luck explaining the Great Pyramid. Good luck.
And it's such a big time frame. Like there's 1,000 years between the pyramids being built and Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings.
Yeah.
1,000 years.
Yeah. Nuts.
Why do I get the impression that behind all of this is leading to ancient aliens?
Yeah. You know that's what Joe's thinking in the back of his
Right.
mind. He's like, I don't know if they did some sort of mapping under the pyramids, and they're showing these possible structures that were built under them. Did you say anything about that?
No.
All the conspiracy people are going crazy. They're like, oh, it's these different chambers, and they're built perfectly symmetrical. I don't even think that that's verified. All of this stuff, I would be interested if it was somebody that knew what they were talking about. Joe Rogan doesn't know what he's talking about at all.
But 1 second we're talking about the Gospels, and the next second we're talking about Göbekli Tepe, and then the pyramids in Egypt. And again, my experience with Joe Rogan is the reason he's interested in it is because it leads to some kind of science fiction conspiracy theory about aliens or whatever. And that's so many people, they're interested in things, but they take the academic side out of it. There's people that have studied this a lot, and they know what they're talking about, and it'd be interesting to talk to those people about this stuff. Unfortunately, the History Channel has turned into just Ancient Alien Central, and it's not real history. And it's just so sad watching the state of our country or the state of the world. It's great to be fascinated with history. It's great to be fascinated with these things. But then you're not answering it in an academic way where people that know what they're talking about can give you real information. You want to believe in the most fantastical thing. Granted, in this, Joe Rogan didn't say anything about ancient aliens, etc. But this is just my limited experience I've had listening to Joe Rogan. I think I know where his mind is going here.
I also appreciate Wes saying, oh, I'm not an archaeologist. Well, you're not a textual critic either.
Right. Yeah, he's not any of
to
these
be
things.
fair, you're really not qualified to talk about any of this.
Right.
So
It doesn't make sense. It's like, how? What were you guys using? What were you doing? How'd you do it? How'd you measure it? How'd you figure it out?
Yeah. You've been to Greece, right?
Yes.
Have you been to Jordan?
No.
Oh, you got to go see Petra.
Yeah?
Petra's phenomenal.
Greece was fantastic.
When he's talking about the pyramids, how did they do that? How did they build that? It is definitely a fascinating question. How did the Egyptians build the pyramids? But the likely answer to that, the true answer, is not going to be as fun for Joe Rogan. It's probably they used some system of pulleys and whatever. It's just an engineering challenge that they accomplished. They were very smart people. It's definitely not they levitated blocks with magnetism, or they had giants carry the stones for them, or they had aliens with their UFO come down and move the stones for them. That's why the mystery is so intriguing to Joe Rogan, because those things are all real possibilities.
yeah, I wish to God he would just have an Egyptologist on.
Right.
To explain, oh, this is actually how they built the pyramids, or this is what they think, or this is the theory of how they think it could have been done.
He immediately goes to the fringe. And that's what interests a lot of people. Me too, when I was a kid. And then I study it and I realize, oh, okay, there's actual real explanations for these things. You don't need to invoke the supernatural and you don't need to invoke aliens. But
Yeah, I mean, you became a man and you put away childish things, you know? Don't we all? It's interesting that going back to what we were talking about before with Joe Rogan being this like gatekeeper and the pressure to be overly affable when you're on with him. So Wes is kind of maneuvering around this ancient alien stuff because I don't think he wants to really get into that with him. So he brings up Greece or whatever and Petra. I wish someone would just shatter Joe's worldview and be, listen, dude, you're crazy. Ancient aliens are not real. You're believing pseudo-history.
yeah, I don't know if someone would be, like you said, brave enough to actually say that because they want to get on the show and they know exactly what the show is about.
And it's the key to getting on a bunch of other shows and getting another bunch of
this stuff was like, has been popular forever. What's the very famous like radio show that was on for years and years where they would discuss all of these things? Coast to Coast. A very famous radio show, and it was popular. This stuff is really popular. It's why, like I said before, like the entire History Channel and the Science Channel on cable TV are basically just giant conspiracy things. Mermaids all day long and ancient aliens, and it's really sad. I'm not saying that there's not like an interesting fascination on these fringe things that you can kind of like be fascinated with, but when it becomes the mainstream way that people understand history and science, it's so problematic and it's really depressing about the future of humanity. Because, like I keep saying, there are people that actually know what they're talking about on these things that are much more credible than the people talking about aliens. But yeah, it's not as sexy. It's not going to be as fun to talk about, you know, the Egyptians used like levers to raise up blocks onto kind of like a scaffolding, whatever they did. I don't know how they did it. Any kind of actual explanation, it's never going to be as fun as the blocks were levitated. You can see how capitalism works here. It's all about ratings, and this type of stuff just gets the ratings. The stuff that students are learning in university won't get the ratings, but it should, because it's actually more interesting to find out what really happened than to believe in some conspiracy science fiction version of events.
I think if we had like a really base level understanding through education and accessibility to education for this country, then it would be less troubling, but people don't even have the actual history down before they hear the conspiracy history.
Right.
So they're not like, oh, I don't buy the conventional story. It's like, no, you don't even know the conventional story. All you know is the conspiracy. So that's why there has to be like a way to repopularize actual learning. And I think in some instances, there are people out there that actually want to learn about this stuff. And the problem is that what they find is this crap as opposed to actual good scholarship. But maybe that's my idealism holding on.
Well, what bothers me is that the conspiracy nonsense we're talking about gets put on at least equal level, often on a higher level, or often, like you said, they don't even know the conventional history, the basic story. So someone looking at it for the first time, they're like, okay, I have to weigh the option here between aliens and the conventional history. And that's just not appropriate. You should go with the consensus view to begin when you don't know what you're talking about. Because the fringe stuff has no credibility at all. It's literally just fantastical stuff that was dreamed up to sell books. And the idea that you're confusing young people and making them think, well, I have to make a decision here between this side and that side. And that's what bothers me. It's like, no, there's no decision here. You're either believing in magic or in history. But it's not history. Ancient Aliens is not history, and it shouldn't be classified as history.
Yeah. The other thing that's frustrating is it's hard to see the poor consequences when it comes to ancient Egypt. okay, yeah, you think the pyramids were built by aliens. Maybe that makes you a little bit racist because you don't recognize that the Egyptian people could have done it on their own, or ancient people were too primitive to do it. But like in the grand scheme of things, it's not that important. But we don't just have that now. Now we're having World War II revisionism.
Right.
Is becoming extremely popular. Popular podcasts. Joe Rogan is trafficking in World War II revisionism. So
is this like Holocaust denial stuff?
Yeah. Joe Rogan's not saying Holocaust denial, but I forget exactly. But he's had people on that traffic in stuff that's at least in the periphery of Holocaust.
Yeah, like alternate science and alternate history is very sexy and it sells, and Joe Rogan loves it. That's part of the reason he has the most popular podcast in the world, because it's just a very sellable thing. Someone that's naturally curious about this stuff, you gravitate toward that. It really is. It's exciting to think maybe there's these alternate truths out there about everything. Unfortunately, it's almost always not true. World War II is very well documented. It's a really scary thing to change that narrative. And I think a lot of it goes back to anti-Semitism.
The sexy thing is actually critically thinking about these issues. Usually the facts on the ground are not the things that are in dispute. It's the conclusions that you draw, and the conspiratorial conclusions are often so overly simplified. Just blatant oversimplifications of reality that they're actually a distraction from doing the thing that's the real work, which is trying to figure out, with all these things being given, what does it all mean?
Right.
Egypt was crazy because you go to Egypt and there's 4,000-year-old paint on the walls. And you're like, what? I can't get paint to stay on my wall for 10 years. And it's almost exclusively because of the climate, and it got buried in sand. But it's so wild. So wild.
When you say that 1% of ancient Egypt has been discovered, what do you really mean by that?
1% has been excavated in terms of what we can actually pull out of the ground and look at artifacts. So there's whole eras of pharaohs that we don't know where they're buried, because we have these lists of pharaohs, and the thing with the pharaohs is that the next pharaoh is always trying to prove that he's the better one. And this is why you go to Egypt and you find statues of Ramses everywhere. And part of it was because Ramses, I think it was Ramses II, he commissioned so many statues of himself. Because he's like, oh, I'm the best, I'm the greatest. And what they couldn't keep up with the commissioning, and they started actually rubbing off the names of previous pharaohs on statues and just putting Ramses on it.
Really?
Because he was just, so you go from the top of Egypt to the bottom of Egypt, and you're going to find statues of Ramses.
He wanted to leave his mark.
And he did, right? Like, it worked.
We're talking about it now in 2024.
I know.
Did you know that they actually found Ramses' body?
No.
Yeah, at the bottom of the Red Sea.
Oh, wow.
It was next to some chariot wheels.
Yeah, I'm surprised Wes is not saying that.
I know.
Yeah. Maybe it's coming. There's just so much shit to respond to all the time. It's like they found Noah's Ark and the Shroud of Turin, and they found Pharaoh at the bottom of the Red Sea. It's like it never stops.
I mean, the good thing is most of it was Ron Wyatt, and that guy's totally discredited. So if you hear that it's him, you're just like, oh, that fucking guy. He's the worst. He's like, I found the Ark, and I found Sodom and Gomorrah, and I found the Garden of Eden, and I found chariot wheels under the Red Sea. One guy found all that stuff. What are you, the guy who collected the Malaysian plane wreckage?
It's like the naked archaeologist guy. He kept finding all these Christian stuff.
Yeah, that guy's the worst.
I don't want to say all Christians are gullible, because certainly a lot of Christians don't fall for this stuff. But it shows you what a market there is. If you're a credited archaeologist and you even hint at that you found Noah's Ark or something, you're going to be on the front page of every Christian newspaper and magazine and publication around the world. And people are going to be talking about it, and apologists are going to be using it. There's so much potential for you. If you don't care about your own integrity, you know where the money is in this stuff. there's people making a living out of finding, and this is a Christian tradition, right? Going all the way back to the Shroud of Turin and even before.
Beginning with the foreskin of Christ.
People just eat this stuff up.
It's also really intimately intertwined with the history of archaeology, and that the archaeology that's happened in that region has been so aspirational. There's always this desire to confirm the biblical narrative, or at least there was for, the first 100 years or so that biblical archaeology was happening. Now I think that the field has changed.
It's coming back. When you look at like these Hobby Lobby people, and they're funding these type of things where their goal is to confirm the biblical narrative.
Well, we covered Josh McDowell and the Museum of the Bible.
Right.
And so places like that, again, because of capitalism, it's like first it started out, it would be countries that were funding archaeological excavations. Then it became universities, so it would be professors, or they'd be professors like Indiana Jones for part of the year, and then they'd go do archaeology when they weren't teaching. But now you also have just private collectors. You have the Museum of the Bible that probably does their own type of thing, and maybe even has better connections with the governments in that region than universities would have.
And if you're discovering things that confirm the biblical narrative, great. It should be done as real history. It shouldn't be, we're looking to confirm this and we're going to disregard what we find that does not confirm it. And that's the problem I have with it. You can't have a bias endeavor when you're doing this stuff. The whole point of this is to get to what actually happened in the past, not what you wanted to have happened in the past.
Archaeology, in a very unique way, is destructive. Like, the process itself is destructive. So as you're going through the layers to get to the earlier and earlier layers, you're destroying the outer layers. So you have to be very meticulous in documenting everything, and you sort of have a responsibility to, if you're the first one there, you're going to be the primary person that's going to go through those layers.
Yeah, it's like when there's a painting under another painting, and maybe the painting underneath was from a more famous artist, but to get to it, you have to destroy the top layer.
Yeah.
Which is also a work of art. I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. You have to be meticulously documenting for posterity, because it is an actual science that you're doing. I don't want Josh McDowell just randomly destroying masks to get to some text that also I may want them to get to, but just so he can do it in the fastest way possible, because he's, who cares about these stupid masks?
Right.
Like, you have to have some reverence for, and again, that's how you're able to match up the archaeology and the timelines, is by saying, okay, we have this pottery at this layer that matches with another site that has similar pottery at this layer.
I just think it's hard to do real history when you have an entire ecosystem of people just looking for anything to pounce on and start publishing articles and doing podcasts about how this confirms the biblical narrative. It's just hard to do real science and real history in that environment, I think.
Even, like you said, within like the secular world of science, if you said, I found Sodom, you would be on the cover of Archaeological Digest or whatever. These sites often hold such places of meaning that there really is an aspiration, even in secular scholars, to discover the truth or get back to them or connect with whatever the historical kernel is of the story that we have. And sometimes we just don't have access to that.
Right.
Like, have you ever tried to think, like, what was the motivation to make something as great as the Pyramid of Giza, the Great Pyramid?
People definitely want to make their mark, right?
Right, but that's a mark that just doesn't even make sense.
There's something to that. I mean, if you think you're a god,
right,
and you have this whole kind of worldview perspective and theology that, you need to make something that and bury yourself with all this crap because that's going to make a difference in your afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
What a dick. I mean, he's talking about ancient Egypt here, something that is lauded for its amazing beauty and artistry. And he's like, it's just buried with a lot of crap. Anything that's not like in the Christian tradition, he just completely brushes off as it's just total crap. Who cares about it? That's the impression I'm getting.
Yeah. I don't know. I'll give Wes a little bit of grace. I think that he's trying to be affable, but yeah.
He just talks about the pharaohs being buried with a bunch of crap.
And that's true. If this was a professor, he wouldn't be talking this way.
Right.
So if he's going to come in and portray himself as, I'm an expert, I have this website where we talk about ancient history, and I can debunk Billy, whatever his name is, and his stupidity because I know like the real history. Then
I just think
you
his
should
true
treat it with some respect.
His true colors come out because he talks as if he's like this, ancient historian and expert. But then he says things like that, like you said, like that's not the way a historian would talk. Like you would have a certain amount of reverence and respect for, ancient Egyptian culture. I don't know.
Yeah, I also think another interesting thing that he could have talked about was the way that archaeology fit into ancient cosmology for people in the ancient Near East. Like the way that they think of things like ladders, Jacob's ladder up to heaven, or the Tower of Babel, the throne on the top of the firmament that God rests on, the like throne room in heaven, the footstool in the temple for God's feet. Architecture was a way that they understood cosmology in the ancient world. And so that's why you have the underworld of death, because when bodies are buried, they're buried underground. And so it makes sense. You're building this ostentatious building. This architecture is reflecting something that you believe about cosmology and something that you believe about passing into the next life. And the crap that you're buried with is expressive of that.
The perceptions of people in the ancient world are just so different. We got it so good right now.
Oh, yeah.
Like longevity, health, food is just on a completely different scale. And so the conventions of needing to make sure that, especially if you're like the richest guy around, that you tick off all the boxes, because you're going to die, and you're probably going to die sooner than you want to, sooner rather than later. And you have this whole perception of, well, if I bury myself with all this stuff and maybe even some of the people, we're just going to kill them and include them too, because they're going to help me out. That's going to help me out in the afterlife.
You need slaves in the afterlife if you're a pharaoh.
Yeah, of course you do.
You can't just
Why
go by
not,
yourself.
right? Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
I find this pretty disgusting from someone that is purporting himself to be some kind of expert. The way he's portraying this culture, he's just completely brushing it off, laughing it off. And I don't think he's coming across super knowledgeable about it either. He's basically saying just very surface level things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we kind of talked about this before when they spoke about Mormonism. I think it's easy to be flippant and dismissive of some sort of religion that you don't believe in, but be very
also,
reverent when it comes to your own faith. And
I mean, I'm sure, Ben, you've seen more than me because you're on X/Twitter more than I am, but Christians are super triggered if you're even remotely critical or remotely disrespectful, let's say, of their preferred history or their preferred narrative of events. But yet, someone like Wes here is just completely flippant and dismissive and outright insulting to entire cultures. So you mentioned Mormonism. But yet, if you were to use that type of language when talking about the Gospels, I know Christians would lose their shit about that.
It's just a weird double standard that exists, I think, where people are really willing to be critical of other people's beliefs, especially religious beliefs, but not willing to set some sort of criteria that would also be able to be used to criticize their own beliefs. And that's a sign of real hypocrisy.
Right.
Khufu's pyramid, what's the timeline that he was even in power?
I don't know. I'm not an Egyptologist or an archaeologist necessarily, but he was
Necessarily, he's not.
Or a textual critic, again.
Yeah.
Or even a doctor at this point. Just a student.
That was like 4,000 years ago. We only really have a tiny little statue of him.
That's
We don't
nuts.
actually have that much about him.
I guess he was busy making a pyramid.
So they say, right?
So they say.
Billy thinks different, but
Well, a lot of people think different. You know, that's what's interesting about it is the archaeological argument that like Dr. Robert Schoch makes about the water erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating argument because it does appear like that's water erosion. And that would put the timeline way, way back.
yeah, I think even just looking at the Sphinx, you can tell that no matter what your perspective is, you should entertain the idea, at minimum, that the head was built later.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it doesn't fit the body.
It has much less erosion. But you could also attribute that to the different densities of the stone. Like, that's one of the things about these layers of limestone. It's like some of them are much more porous and some they erode easier.
Yeah,
You do see that,
yeah.
you know, and I think they're doing a terrible disservice by covering the Sphinx with, like, new stones. And, you know, they redid the paws and they're doing all that. Like, my God, people, like, leave it alone.
I just looked up as he was talking, Dr. Robert Schoch. And this is just Wikipedia, so I'll take it for what it's worth. But it says, is an American associate professor of natural sciences at the College of General Studies, Boston University. Following initial work as vertebrate paleontologist, Schoch co-authored and expanded the fringe Sphinx water erosion hypothesis since 1990 and is the author of several pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific books. And then within the Wikipedia article, there's response from other academics. And it says, Mark Lenner, an American archaeologist and Egyptologist, has disputed Schoch's analysis, stating, you don't overthrow Egyptian history based on one phenomenon like a weathering profile. That's how pseudoscience is done, not real science. And historian Ronald Fritz has described Schoch as a pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific writer. It's funny to me, that's the historian that Joe Rogan knows about. He doesn't know about all the people doing real history. He knows about the pseudo-historical ones. The ones that, they have a doctorate next to their name, but they're saying the most fringe thing possible. And those are the ones you want to have on your show. Those are the ones you want to talk to. Not the people in the majority that likely are correct. So I just think there's a big disconnect here. So I certainly don't have a problem with somebody having a fringe viewpoint. If you're a trained scholar or a doctor and you come to your own opinion that is outside of the mainstream, that's completely fine. The problem I have with it is people that don't know anything about the subject immediately gravitating to the less than 1% opinion on the issue because it's the most fantastical and the most fanciful, however you want to describe it. That really is the fundamental problem with what Joe Rogan is doing and the way too many people look at science and history.
I think that you said this earlier as well. What we need right now is someone who can take a step back and say, listen, Joe, you're making references to all these fringe scientists. Let me tell you about the actual science. But we don't have is a real scientist. We have an apologist. And Christians should want to use the best techniques to get to the truth because they allegedly are part of a religion that believes in the truth. But what this shows me is that Wes actually knows the guy that he's talking about and the theory about water erosion and the head of the Sphinx being at a different time. So this could have been an opportunity for Wes to come on and say, listen, you had Billy Carson on. I'm going to come here and show you, like, here's the difference between pseudoscience and real science. Here's the difference between fake scholarship and real scholarship. But instead what we're getting is a further muddling of what real scholarship and fake scholarship is. Because Wes is not here telling Joe actual scholarship. He's giving him apologetic bullshit.
Right. Yeah. And Joe, to me, the way he answers every question is leading back to some fantastical conspiracy version of history that he's heard about and he's interested in. He largely ignores the apologetic stuff that Wes is talking about, and he immediately gravitates toward this other stuff.
Oh, so much of it is under sand for so long. Like the the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut was mostly under sand for a long, long time.
Wow.
Before they uncovered it. And fortunately, the aridness of Egypt preserves things like crazy.
When, if you do take that timeline, the Robert Schoch timeline, and you say, okay, so you're talking about thousands of years of rainfall, you have to go back to when there was rainfall in the Nile Valley, so now you're back 9,000 years. One of the more interesting things about hieroglyphs and the interpretations of it is that the ancient hieroglyphs, the ancient versions of pharaohs, rather, when they go back, past the established dates of 2500 BC and before that, you get to 30,000 years ago, and they say that these are myth. This is not representative of an actual history. This is some sort of a mythical history.
Yeah, numbers are tricky in ancient languages because it's not entirely clear whether numbers are meant to be representational.
Is that why they said that Noah lived 600 years old?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, you have that, and you have the Sumerian king lists, which have people living thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years too. And there are some interesting academic articles on the probability of the numbers that come up in those, because we have a base 10 counting system because we count our fingers. Ancient Near Eastern cultures like the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, they had a base 12 counting system because they would count each hinge, or what do you call these, spaces 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
There's different joints of the finger.
Yeah, the joints, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have 360 degrees in a circle, 365 days in a year. This comes from the Mesopotamian counting conventions. And you look at some of these lists, and they're operational and all divisible by 12 and 60. And you're like, what's going on here? So not all of them, but enough of them where it's statistically impossible. And I don't totally know what to make of those things, because you do have the genealogies, I believe it's Genesis chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 11, where they're all divisible by these types of numbers that were very common in the ancient Near East. They're not random. Whereas if we look at the genealogies later in Chronicles and Kings of the ages of the Israelite kings, they're random. And so it's just what do we do with that?
Right.
Because numbers are also far more representational, which is why we see numbers like 12 and 40 and 7 come up in the Bible, but also other ancient Near Eastern literature. There are certain numbers in Egyptian society that also were seen as perfect numbers, or numbers that you wanted to incorporate. So,
what's the earliest interpretation of calendars? What is the earliest where they did decide what a year was?
I have no idea.
Because you got to imagine, if the average lifespan wasn't so good back then. Yeah. A lot of people got infected, died of war, famine, all these things. It would take quite a long time for people to figure out what a year was.
Right.
You have we're going thousands and thousands of years ago. We have to establish, okay, a day is, let's put this stick in the ground. When the shadow is here, this is where we start.
Yeah.
When the shadow goes all the way around like that, okay, maybe we can mark these off, okay, now we've got a sundial.
And there are different timekeeping conventions depending on society. Ancient Jews had a different timekeeping convention than ancient Romans. And so that's why you see, in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about there being evening and there being morning, is because, Jews today, right? You start the Sabbath on sundown the day before, right? So that's why. It's because there's different cycles, and so we go on a 24-hour time system. But ancient Jews had a different convention of that. Ancient Romans had a different convention of that. Ancient, Mesopotamian cultures had their own kind of conventions about these things, and calendars were all over the place. In when you get to the Julian calendar, and they're like, we gotta standardize this thing because everybody's operating on a different, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. Ancient timekeeping is very inexact and very messy, and so you kind of got to take certain things with a grain of salt,
Right.
in terms of that. But ancient calendars, I don't even know. I know that talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the group in Qumran, who were they were a sectarian group of Jews who believed that the Jews in Jerusalem had basically capitulated and were not holy enough. And part of their reasoning is that they believe they have a perfect calendar. And so they use a different calendar that doesn't have to do things like incorporate an extra month every certain number of years because, their thing is not perfect. And part of their reasoning as to why they're like the chosen is that they have a timekeeping system that they say is perfect.
Many cultures used a 13-month calendar, right? Like, what was the logic behind that?
I don't know.
He doesn't know, Joe.
I know, this is like so far from... I thought Wes was going to try to take it back. I mean, I guess he kind of did with Qumran, but...
Joe Rogan, it's so frustrating because when you see what he's doing, like, he just always wants to get to some kind of, like, crazy...
When you think about the oral tradition with calendars, like, they were just they put a stick in the ground. Like, does he think people live to be a day old?
Right.
It's like, well, we got to make it through this first day before war and famine kills us, and then we'll realize what a day is.
I'm going to give the same answer Wes did. I'm no historian here. I don't know what I'm talking about, but to me, it seems to make sense that it would have gone more by seasons. So they understand when the weather changes. That's the first way that you would delineate a year, and then a day would be delineated by the sun rising and falling. So that would make sense to me. And then there's different mathematical systems that people use to organize that thought.
We've said it a bunch of times, but I'll say it again. It would just be a good time for Wes to say, I don't really know anything about that, Joe, but while you have me here, let's talk about something that I do actually know about. They're just both talking out of their ass right now. They literally have a producer who could look it up on the internet.
Right.
Them.
Yeah.
Just doesn't make sense to me, really.
Archaeologists, okay, there it is. World oldest calendar, 12,000 years old.
Yeah, that's wild.
So it is on Göbekli Tepe. Oh, the ancient carvings of the sun, moon, and various constellations sits on a pillar. Göbekli Tepe, 12,000
We should rename this show like Joe Rogan Google stuff live on the air.
Yeah, for real. And I guess they're just dead set to contradict me every time I say something, huh?
We use a so-called lunisolar calendar to mark the changing of the seasons.
Right.
Interesting. So it was at least
Good job, John.
representative of the fact that we know when the days start getting shorter, it starts getting colder, and then it warms up again. The days start getting longer.
I mean, honestly, we should have the biggest podcast in the universe. Because you literally said what Joe Rogan just said without looking it up.
That's true.
Which is one of the things that's so fascinating about some of the constructions of the pyramid, where on the summer solstice, these pillars line up so perfectly that the light shines straight down these hallways and illuminates everything. It's like,
Right.
how did you guys nail that?
Yeah, I mean, just because they're ancient doesn't mean they're stupid.
Well, they're
right?
just brilliant.
Yeah.
They weren't just stupid. They were fucking brilliant. That's what's, we weren't just ancient. It's just so weird that people were so vastly more intelligent, at least in terms of their ability to build things, than anyone else, anywhere around there. That's what's so weird about Egypt to me. It's like there's amazing pieces of, like, even ancient Greece is incredible, but I can kind of believe you did it, you know?
Right.
When you deal with 2,300,000 stones in the Great Pyramid, and some of them like 50 tons, 60 tons.
That's pretty
from
crazy.
500 miles away. Like,
Yeah.
what did you do?
I don't like to get into comparing different ancient cultures and saying which one was better, but I do not think that historians would agree that Egyptian archaeology is more impressive than Greek archaeology.
I just don't think he knows what he's talking about.
He has no idea what he's talking about.
I think Wes is right. Ancient people were not dumb. They were limited by the collective knowledge that they had at their disposal. We have thousands of years of history and knowledge that's been built up that we can draw upon. But for their time, they were trying to make sense of the world the same way that, in a proto-scientific way, the same way people are trying to make sense of the world today. So we shouldn't be shocked that they're able to figure out how to build stuff.
No, I mean, there's no doubt it's an amazing, interesting story. I just wish we would stick to the true history that we know.
And again, Joe Rogan is trying to get to some sort of the ancient Egyptians couldn't build this stuff, so therefore it must have been built by some sort of visitor from another planet, or this technology would not be possible, and that's just not true. We talked about the Babylonian ziggurats, and there was a bunch of cultures flourishing in that area at that time, and Egypt was hegemonic, was like the predominant power for part of the time, but there were other powers around too, and ideas were traded between cultures, and they influenced each other, but they certainly learned how to develop certain technologies. And human beings have always been building stuff. That's just part of what we do.
Yep.
Well, you know about Terra Preta in the Amazon. Do you know about...
When you open the Bet Parks app, you're in the zone. Winning is always a rush, but the money is in the...
No.
Oh, Terra Preta is their particular rich soil that is man-made soil.
Oh, yes, I did know.
That's
I do know about that.
Combination of charcoal and bacteria, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievably fertile in terms of your ability to grow food on it. And they made it, and we don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
And it's man-made stuff.
No shit, dude. That's how agriculture began. Human beings figured out, you have to burn a certain season, burn this, and then that creates nutrients in the soil. This is what the first people who grew agricultural food, the indigenous knowledge that they have passed along to us tens of thousands of years later. So I just think, I don't understand, I don't think that he has a grasp on history.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the same thing. It's great that he's fascinated with these things. Where is he going with it? Yeah, it is amazing that Egyptians built the pyramids and the mathematics that was behind all that. And then in the Amazon with the Terra Preta, whatever he's talking about. That is all fascinating stuff. There's people that study this. Why don't you have them on the show? I don't understand where you're going with it. Again, my experience with Joe Rogan is that he's not going in a traditional historical route. He's always going to go in a fringe direction.
I know. Maybe it's just triggering for me. I feel like I can very easily get into this sort of obsessive mode when I get a question in my mind. So Wes is talking about Roman concrete, for example. I could see myself falling into a few weeks of frantically researching Roman concrete. But what I wouldn't be doing is trying to look for the most outlandish theory behind Roman concrete. What I would want to do is understand it as much as I can to know, who actually knows what they're talking about. What do the people that actually know think? Even if they don't know, what do they think? Because that's what I'm interested in. I want to actually know what happened, or if we don't understand it, why don't we understand it? How was this developed in a way that we don't have any trace of it now, or we've lost that knowledge somewhere along the line? Not because I want to say, it was a big conspiracy. They burned the books with Roman concrete knowledge in it. That's fun, maybe, but it's not doing history.
Yeah, I think that sums up what we've been saying this whole time.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.